This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. On today's episode, we have the privilege of speaking with the featured artists of the multimedia art collection Slavery in Motion, Romaine McNeil, Tatiana Sha-Shonna Rogers, and Julia Mallory. Romaine's an archive is who curated the collection. It is a Mellon-funded Diaspora Solidarities Lab that explores grief through the various media in the arts, digital storytelling and mapping, and curation. The collection Slavery in Motion was inspired by the life of Malia, a young African woman who was sold and lived as a captive in the mid-18th century Westmoreland, Jamaica. Malia and other enslaved women and girls in Jamaica are the focus of the Romaine's lab member Jessica Newby's dissertation research. The 4 original artworks in the exhibition are by Black women artists from across the diaspora. In keeping with the core philosophy and principles of Romaine's and the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, the collection enacts a Black feminist ethic of care that accentuates and memorializes Malia's story of captivity, motherhood, loss, and frequent fugitivity. It seeks to transcend the obscurity, silence, erasure, and limitations of colonial archives in relaying the complexity of enslaved women's lives. So the members of the Romaine's Lab include Samantha Stevens, PhD candidate in English at the University of Virginia. Her research focuses on the intersection of enslavement and technology in the Black Atlantic. Kevin Asen, PhD candidate in the Faculty of Education at McGill University. His research explores theories and forms of racial and queer subjectivities, death, grief, and their pedagogical impossibilities through Black studies, queer theory, and psychoanalysis. And Jessica Newby, PhD candidate in the Department of History at the Johns Hopkins University. Her research includes enslaved women, family and kinship, sexuality, violence, and mourning throughout the Black Atlantic during the 18th century. Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson is the faculty director of Romaine's, associate professor in the Department of History at the Johns Hopkins University. Her work explores histories of slavery, African diaspora, and the Black life in the Americas. So on today's episode, we will be talking with Jessica Newby, as well as the artists. Tatiana is a Brooklyn-based sculptor of sound, color, cinema, and story. Her favorite mediums include ink, watercolor, song, and poetry. Romaine McNeil is a Jamaican-based artist who uses brushstrokes, palette knives, and enigmatic concepts to transcend ordinary thinking and emotions into powerful and provocative images on canvas. She is originally from the parish of Westmoreland, Jamaica. Sha-Shonna Rogers is a multidisciplinary artist with a focus on cinematography and still photography from West Baltimore, Maryland. She is also a current senior at Morgan State University. Drawing inspiration from her everyday surroundings and the pulse of her community, her creative style is shaped by her environment, resulting in narratives that pulse with life and truth. Julia Mallory is a storyteller committed to being a good steward of and vessel for her ancestors' stories. Her foundational creative love language is poetry, and she moves between genres with a range of mediums from text to textiles. Her latest loves include creating stop-motion animated collages and building 1006, a multi-generational community space for collective learning, connection, and creativity. Julia is the mother of 3 children and is from the south side of Harrisburg. You can learn more about the Slavery in Motion project by watching the Artist Talk on the Baltimore Museum of Art's YouTube page. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have a very special episode where we have the artists who worked on the Slavery in Motion. So we have Romaine McNeil, Tatiana Sha-Shonna Rogers, and Julia Mallory. We also have Jessica Newby, who brought together the artists for this particular collection. There was an artist talk at the Baltimore Museum of Art on January 16th. You can go online and check that out on their YouTube channel. Today, we're going to talk to the artists about their process, how they approach their work on Black life, and what is the role of study in their artistic practices. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So let's start with Jessica. You can give a little context on the project itself, and then we can dive into some more questions with the artists and about their pieces.
Thank you, Dr. Newby. And thank you for having us on the podcast. It's a real honor. I think giving context to the project, it would also be helpful to give context to something we call the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, which is something I'm a part of. It's a broader ecosystem, an archipelago of a Black feminist initiative that was founded by Dr. Yomaira Figueroa Vasquez and Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson. And as a part of that Mellon-funded grant, it is a community of scholars and activists and artists that are spread across what we call smaller microlabs. And they perform solidarity work across not just disciplines, but also outside of the academy in a number of different projects, community-based projects, media projects, etc. And so my role within the Diaspora Solidarities Lab is through a microlab that's called Remains an Archive. And Remains an Archive is a microlab that focuses upon creating projects, interdisciplinary Black feminist-based projects that explore different conceptions and expressions of grief and mourning, whether that is within community-based projects, whether that is through history, whether that is through critical thought and methods. And so we're a collection of scholars from different disciplines. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Johns Hopkins University. My colleague, Kevin Asen, is in history of education at McGill University. And my other colleague, Samantha Stevens, is in English at the University of Virginia. And so what remains is essentially is this community of scholars that are bringing our own individual research interests together and seeing what projects can emerge from that while still rooted in the Black feminist principles of solidarity work within DSL. That was a lot of context to build up to the Slavery in Motion project. The Slavery in Motion project came about from Remains' brainstorming of how we would be a part of a symposium that took place at the Avery Center for African American Research and Culture in Charleston, South Carolina, which took place in the fall of 2024. And so it was going to be this collection and / presentation of the work that the DSL had done over the 2-year grant that it was initially given from the Mellon Foundation. And so when we were brainstorming what Remains' contribution would be to that symposium exhibit presentation, we kind of brainstormed, well, what are some elements of our own individual research that we can come together and not just form a project, but a project that's also attuned to the space that we were in. Anyone that has been to the Avery Center knows that it's a place that's suited for the exhibit of art pieces, but also the exhibit of art pieces in different formats. So there's art that you would see exhibited on a wall, but then they also have spaces for multimedia staging and production. And then when we were thinking about the actual what the project would look like, we also wanted to tap into the existing ecosystem that the DSL had. The DSL is, of course, comprised of faculty members and PhD students like myself, but there's also a lot of community partners and that work with localized initiatives and groups. But then we also have extremely talented artists as well. And so we wanted to brainstorm a project that would bridge more, I guess, what you could say, knowledge within the academy with the knowledge productions that are taking place outside of the academy, because I think that that's also a really important ethic and value of the DSL. So having said that, we knew personally and were very close friends with some of the artists that were within the DSL to begin with. Tatiana, who was one of the artists we would soon begin to initiate a partnership with. We already knew that she was an extremely talented artist. And then when we were speaking with our lab director, Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, about other potential artists that we would approach for a potential collaboration, she told me about this incredibly talented artist named Sha-Shonna Rogers that worked with the New Generation Scholars program that's based in Baltimore, Maryland. And then we also, every time the DSL accepted new community fellows, we always were told who they were and what their research was. And so I remember when Julia Mallory came into the DSL, I remember reading about her work, how it was based in grief work, and feeling so intrigued, like, wow, that would be really interesting. And I say all of this to say, I say that we identified this synergy to this synergy for all of these artists to work together because of what we were thinking the subject of the actual project would be. My own research deals with histories of slavery in the 18th century, and my dissertation work is on a community of enslaved women who lived in Westmoreland Parish, Jamaica. And so one of the enslaved women that I focused on in my dissertation, whose name was Malia. Malia has a long and complicated history in that she was enslaved. She came into Jamaica in 1761, and about 6 to 7 years after she arrived in Jamaica, she had a daughter named Sylvia. And Sylvia lived for just 15 months before she died. And shortly, about a year after her daughter's death, Malia engaged in this string of fugitivity that was very frequent, up to 14 times at least. She ran away from her owner following the death of her daughter. And after the 14th time, he sold her off the island to a trader who took her to Savannah, Georgia. And so when we were thinking about what Romaine's contribution would be to the DSL's final symposium, we thought that what would it be like if we were to engage this history with the principles of the DSL, with solidarity work that takes place across disciplines, taking this story. I think it's worth pointing out that this story, Malia's story, is one that had been relayed in a very specific way up to that point. By other historians. And so we wanted to think about what would it look like if we tried to produce alternative forms of knowledge about this story, not just from the perspective of someone who's being formally trained as a historian, but through other knowledge producers from outside of the academy. And because my background is within Black studies, I tried to think diasporically, right? I can remember one of my advisors when I did my master's thesis, and which was where I initially wrote about Malia's story. And he told me that something I would need to keep in mind as I went forward is to ground the story within Caribbean thought and knowledge production. And that was very important. And that's something that stayed with me ever since. And I say that to say, when I was thinking about who else I would envision and really want to be a part of the project, I knew that I needed to have someone who was from Jamaica. And so when I was thinking about, okay, well, where can I go with that? I don't know any Jamaican artists personally, but I know that I do follow a very talented Jamaican artist on Instagram whose name was Romaine McNeil. And so when I was, already approaching Tatiana and Sha-Shonna and Julia about being on the project, I had this idea in my mind that I was very nervous about initially. And I thought, well, I'm just going to have to go ahead and try to ask and see what happens. It was a Hail Mary pass, essentially, because I'd been following Romaine for some time, but we didn't know each other from Adam. And I knew it would be very random for me to all I had was her email address and her Instagram IG handle. And so I literally just sent a DM on Instagram introducing myself and asking if she would be interested in the project. And I was stunned when she accepted. And fast forward about 1.5 years later, and here we are. So that was a very long context to the project.
This is an academic podcast.
Okay.
Academics talk, girl. You're fine. So, but I think it's important context and it's helpful context, right? Because the intentionality behind the bringing together of the artists, the vision behind the project itself is important. it's important to know that this was intentional. And while thankfully everyone agreed, right? Like people were asked for a reason. And that there was a synergy between the collective that came together for Slavery in Motion. So, with that background and context, let's jump into talking with the artists. So this is actually a question I think it would be helpful if everyone could speak to, thinking about the work that you do. You can talk about, like, obviously this project, but even in your other work that you do, what drew you as an artist to work on Black life? I don't know if Julia, would you like to start?
Sure. And I think I'll start with this project specifically. So, as Jessica mentioned, I was a 2023 DSL Community Fellow. And when Kevin and Jessica reached out to me, we were talking initially a conversation around my community grief work. And so when Jessica introduced me to Malia's story, the part that resonated with me felt an instant connection, because part of the catalyst, at least my interpretation, part of the catalyst that sparks what I call Malia's like momentarily marinage is the death of her child, Sylvia. And as a child loss survivor, I deeply resonated with that story. And so for me, the work around Black life is also honoring Black death. And I think those through lines are very present in my work, like how to bring those stories, so to speak, back to life, and how do we honor the Black dead? And so I think working with Malia's story and feeling this connection to the circumstances that disconnected her from her child, even temporarily before Sylvia's passing, and then permanently, so to speak, earthside. So I just instantly, when Jessica talked to me about coming on board, I just felt an instant connection. It was an immediate yes for me.
For me, like similar to what Julia just said, there was also an instant connection, but it was much more because of just, like my entire like life leading up to this point. My mother really like emphasized the importance of knowing like not just about like Black history generally, but about like the importance of knowing like specific like individual stories. Like the way she taught me how to read books was actually through like chapter books about like this enslaved Black boy. And like, so I feel like my entire life, I've always been thinking about not just like US Black history, but just like diasporic history, and how like we're all so interconnected and how similar so many of these stories are. But I think what really stood out when I was meeting with Jessica and like reading her work, she had said to me this one time, like the difference between what it meant to escape from a plantation or a slave pen on an island versus the US. Because in the US, there could be a goal in mind of freedom, but on an island, it's like there's nowhere to go but the island. And so I don't know, I just, something about all of those meetings that we were having and just reading about Malia and like just empathizing so deeply with her because she was a child when she was taken, just really enraged me. But also like I just felt such a surge of like love and care for her that really made me want to be able to give her something, not even just for her, but for like the millions of individuals who don't even have that, you know what I mean, don't even have that opportunity. And so yeah, I feel like the way that I lead my life, I was just kind of like, oh, this is something that I am clearly being called to do. So of course I'll do it, you know.
Sha-Shonna?
I think, I guess like for me, like going back to like the foundation, and the question was as an artist.
Yeah, what draws you to work on Black life?
Black life. So for me, I think growing up, I struggled a lot with like self-hatred. And I think it took me a minute to like realize that's what I was dealing with. I remember, and like, I think the first experiences I had was like in 4th and 5th grade, which now I'm like, wow, I was such a baby. But I think I had became aware of like how people view Black people and how people view people from Baltimore. And so I remember like doing like all of these things to try to separate myself from what I guess people associated with being from Baltimore, like Black, changing the way I talk. I would try to like change the music that everybody around me was listening to, anything that I felt like I could like just separate myself in any way. And so when I got to middle school, I remember like a lot of that increasing. And I think because of my usage of social media and everything, I remember like they used to put out these posts on Instagram that would be like, if a woman is like brown skin, that means this. If she's light skin, it's this. And if she's dark skin, is that. And then being in like class, I went to an all girls school. So being in a basically an all black women's school and kind of like being in a room and like everybody kind of just, I guess, feeding off of that self hatred. But going back to like a lot of us not knowing that's what we was dealing with. And by the time I got to, I want to say, ninth grade till I was like 16 or 15, and I was able to call out and be like, wow, I think I'm sick. Like I'm like mentally sick. I know what I'm feeling is not what I'm supposed to be feeling. And not really having like that support outside of like, I guess that external support in the way that I needed it. And around the time I had met one of my mentors, Sha-Shonna from New Generation Scholars. And I met her, she had came and did like a talk to my school. I was in the ninth grade. And her program was centered around just African knowledge and like the importance of youth understanding, you from Baltimore understanding who are you as a Black person, part of the African diaspora. What is your purpose? If you are an artist, what is your purpose as a Black artist? And learning that through travel, through mentorship, and just diving into like archives and like the history. And that's something I wasn't getting in public school. So when I seen her, I was like, yeah, I got to do this. And then acknowledging like the suffering that I was going through mentally. So I did that program for the first time in 2017. So I was 16. And it was a transformative summer. I remember crying a lot, dealing with a lot of like pain, getting into a lot of arguments with like my family at home because it was like this awakening. I think once you're shown the truth and you've been hidden from the truth for so long, I feel like that emotion, you never know how it might come out. For me, it was anger. But going to like, I guess also within that summer, like awakening like this artist within me at the same time. I think growing up, I always had like this passion for art, but it wasn't until 2017 where I was able to like embrace it and to connect it to who I was as like as a young Black woman. But going back, I feel like I'm like going into a tangent, but I'm like going to connect everything. I think going back to like public schools, I felt like, especially in Baltimore, art isn't something that's pushed a lot. It isn't like a thing where people are like, yeah, you could be an artist, you could be a filmmaker. To them, it's like, that's not a serious thing. And for a minute, I believed in myself. I feel like if you got a lot of people telling you the same thing over at a young age, you start feeling like that's the truth. And so I kind of pushed like the artist within me away, at least the filmmaker, the photographer, like, and me that I knew I always wanted to be. I kind of like, I guess like shunned it a little bit. And then in 2020, when I graduated high school, it was a crazy year, the pandemic, and just dealing with grief. I dealt with grief a lot that year. And Miss Christmas had contacted me. We never lost contact, but I stopped on the program because of just school and like everything else. But she was like, I want you to come back in 2020. And so when I came back, it was like everything that I had been dealing with, I was revisiting. And then I was asking myself at the same time, why am I pushing like this artist and me away if like this is a passion of mine? But I think it took for me to be back into a space to be surrounded by like a woman like Miss Christmas or like Alfina Yawan or a cinematographer like Kirby Griffin, like these amazing artists and community workers who are showing me like the importance and like the possibility of being an artist and being true to yourself, being true to your community and your people. And after 2020, I think from there was like, I just want to embrace like who I am as an artist, but also be a vessel for my people. Like, I don't really see the purpose in me doing work that doesn't serve myself justice, that doesn't serve my people justice. It's like this amazing filmmaker, Haley Garima, he had quoted that he said when he realized that the sickness that we always got to heal from because of colonization and how he doesn't want to be a filmmaker that's continuing to contaminate his own people, that stuck with me because that's something that I live by. I want to be a vessel, but I can't contaminate. I can't be a vessel if I'm contaminating my people. So for me, that's like my main thing is to highlight like Black life because that's what I am. And I want to just tell stories that I feel like my people deserve the stage for. And going back to like Malia's story, I feel like that's the story that needs to be told. Like it's something that most people haven't heard of. I didn't know about until I got brought onto the project and wanted to be a vessel for like Malia's energy and Sylvia's energy in the best way possible. So fuck it. That would be everything. Cool.
Thank you. How about you, Romaine?
My journey go with difference because I shied away from anything artificial in work for like a good while, you know. And I think part of the reason is for me to dive into something that's so personal, I would have to first be able to balance the effects of it. And I didn't know how to do that. And it's funny that when you contacted me, I didn't hesitate to say yes because a few months leading up to that, there was a shift in my creative energy, and I started to do more eccentric work. I started to research more about African tribes, and it's like, let's go because I'm predominantly a student teacher and abstract, and I didn't touch on those subjects, you know, slavery and anything like that in my work. And I was like, all right, you know, let me go with it and see where it leads me. And I started to do all these research outside of, you know, and then you contacted me. I'm like, okay, it was just in preparation. So I can't fight it. So I didn't hesitate to say yes. But I think I needed to start this journey because not only did it become personal because I feel like I'm intertwined into the space because I have to visit there, you know, and when I read about her running away, not to escape, but to kind of restore balance for herself. And I think that's why I use the scales in my painting because that for her after the death of her daughter was so significant that she wasn't trying to escape. She was just trying to get back herself, you know, to feel human, to feel like she matters, to feel like she had some worth, you know. And if you ever visit Westmoreland at a certain time, like there are moments when you go to the beach, when you go to the fields and you stay there for the sunset, you know. And I feel like she'd run away in those moments where she would just like, yeah, I need this. This is mine and I'm claiming it. And it's interesting that you run away so many times and you get flogged and you get ill treated. But in the same breath, it doesn't outweigh what you feel when you do escape into the bushes or to the rivers or to the seas. And you're like, I need this more. And whatever you do to me when I get recaptured, it doesn't even face you. And I think as a young teen, that resilience and that wildness, she needed to keep that and she was determined to keep it. So my work is basically it started before Malia and it's continuing after her. And I love that about being a part of this project because now I'm like, all right, I can actually deal with anything Afrocentric without getting upset because you're taught certain things in school and it's just like it's negative and it's heavy, but when you're introduced to something that's a little lighter and a little more positive, you're like, it's not all bad. There are things that are happening that can open up doors for you to understand something different. For me, it's not just black life, it's life. It's how we perceive ourselves as human beings. And I think we were taught like, slaves were like just things, objects. And a lot of that is passed down from generation to generation. So you don't see yourself. So you don't see yourself as anything of value. And that I try to tackle that in my work. So it becomes more of like a personal thing that I'm not so much trying to do it as a group. When I do a painting, I want you to look at it and do a reflection. That's the important thing for me for my work. Is like it's reflection based. You have to dig deep for you before you can do other things for other people. And for me, it's very cathartic and it's very re-energizing. Like I don't see myself and I haven't seen myself doing anything else other than what I'm doing now because there's a purpose for me to do it in this way. And nothing happens before time because like I said, I never ventured into anything that had to do with slavery in my PhDs. Like never. It was more about how do you heal from looking at something that poses questions and probably gives you answers at the same time. But now it had to shift because you need to dig a little deeper and talk about the blackness and the Afrocentric and what people have gone through. Slaves in Westmoreland was horrible. Half of the places that I passed, I would never imagine that these things were happening beyond what if you teach in school. You have to be intentional about looking for this information in order to find it. And so I'm honored to be able to continue her story in this way.
Thank you. I think that you all speaking to, the role that who you are has played in the pieces in the work that you do, but also in the pieces that you've created for the Slavery in Motion podcast is so important. I know, Romaine, you mentioned that you started studying prior to this project coming up. And so I want to build on that a little bit and ask all of you, like, what is the role of study in your artistic practice? Julia?
I'm always studying. It's something that I'm a person that's like perpetually curious. So I'm always studying. I'm always researching. I'm always pulling a book off of the bookshelf. So study is super important to me. I think that as an artist, where I try to bridge the gap is I'm not I think as an artist, I'm not always interested in a one-for-one translation of what I've studied. I think I'm also really invested in trying to translate the things that we can't always describe. So a lot of and Romaine mentioned this. So I consider myself a storyteller. So my contribution to this project is it's text-based, it's poetry. There's also some sound work, some tracks that I've assembled and put together and composed. But I also am a visual artist and work in collage and I guess what people traditionally call like abstract expressionism. And so for me, I think I'm trying to really, I think, capture like the interior life of Black folks in my work. And so even though I'm studying and I'm taking what I'm learning, I'm really interested in like really trying to convey the thing that really can't be conveyed, if that makes sense. So I'm interested in, I think since I got really intentional about doing even like community grief work, since the death of my oldest son, Julian, in 2017, I think I've become very invested too in this idea of like, not just Black interior life, but like Black people and emotions, and our emotional life. And like my latest form of study has been trying to read scholars and artists and writers and poets who are trying to convey that even the absence of appreciation for Black emotionality is a form of oppression. And like a book that I'm reading right now called She Is Weeping really talks about the whole point of like scientific racism is using, basically creating a Black other. But the basis of a lot of that was saying how we were so emotionally different.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fascinating piece about that is, and then obviously, creating this capitalistic system that has to have an other in order to do its labor without remorse. But it's interesting because if we showed what this one particular book is talking about, like names it like emotional excess. If we show ourselves as being kind of these emotional people, so to speak, that are like wayward emotionally, then that's a problem. But then if we also do not show the expected form of emotional connection, then that's also a problem. So I think for me, study is so critical because I think it is so easy to be in this world where I feel like the sites of production are always hidden from us.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we don't, like, I always want to know why. I feel like I'm a 4-year-old child constantly saying why, but why, but why. And so for me, study is my way to feed that consistent why, because something is wrong, but you can't always put your finger on it. And so for me, study is like literally me putting my finger on it. Like something's wrong here. I want to know why. And I think part of what feels like a sense of responsibility to other Black folks too, to just be like, hey, y'all, like this didn't just form out of nowhere. Did you know this is why things are the way that they are? So that we also understand, are there different set of choices available to us? How can we disrupt? How can we be disruptive or not useful to these systems in certain kind of ways? But I think if we can't trace the through line, we always feel like, and I hate to I know the world is become kind of like this, like Black, white binary, and white being anything or Black being anything that's not white in some ways too. But I'm like always like, okay, well, what can we do to really like reclaim, disrupt, and just be informed? So study for me is just, I don't know, like I said, I'm always studying, but I don't want to, in my work, I don't want to always do a one for one translation. And I think there's also, in telling like, or trying to tell what I feel like is Malia's story, I think Tatiana also mentioned like wanting to give something. So study is also a way that I feel like I am giving something. And I think for Black folks, especially coming out of an oral tradition, I think like if everybody can't touch the books or the text, how can I take that back out and be useful? Because even as a young person, like I was always a voracious reader and I always had a book in my hand. And I just remember people in my hood always being so like, they were so enchanted and so encouraging. And like if I had a book, it's like, oh, read something for me, baby. Like it was always that. And so I feel like study to me is a way that I also give back. So yeah, study for me is so critical to my practice because I know that Black folks ain't just drop out of the sky. And so I always want to know, what are the means that we arrived here? Whose shoulders are we on? Whose wings are we on? Like, what does that look like?
Thank you.
I think for me, I study the sign. I study that note even when people are having a conversation, like what is not being said in that note in their pocket, because that is where, for me, like the vital information is. The thing that you can't say that I need to find so I can put it visually so you can see it. And you have to really be in tune because a lot of what we study sometimes, you won't find it in books, and I think for me, as draining as that has become sometimes, it is essential to be able to pick up what your eyes are saying, and how you're even breathing when you're having a conversation with somebody, how it is affecting you emotionally. And that's what I study to use to help create, because that is the important thing, the ingredient that I'm going to need to put on canvas to show me, so that when you look back at it, you'll be like, that's it. I saw the emptiness, and that's what I couldn't see. That's what I couldn't feel. So studying for me helps to highlight what you're not understanding about yourself, or even what I'm not understanding about me. And it's weird because I also use music to help me to study, because there are frequencies that I probably can't tap into visually that I can tap into musically. That helps me to translate what it is that is happening, and it plays such a vital role because you have to know what you want to present, even if it's not definitive. You have to know, we have to feel something that is there that you need to present to help somebody, because my work is about helping people to heal, helping people to grow, helping people to change, because that's necessary, because a lot of people don't look at you as a Black person and think that you're anybody that needs to progress. Just stay where you are, and I think for me to even start that body of work, I had to study things that I wasn't ready to study. I had to read things that I didn't want in my mental state. But I had to, in order to bring across what I thought was important for someone to see, to change, to evolve. Because I'm not creating for me. I never create for me. And as soon as I create, I know that this piece is going to do something that I'm not even sure of the level of impact that it's going to have, but I know that it's going to be powerful. So the more you study, the more you're able to tap into certain things, the better it is for you to create. And I think it's truly important.
For me, it's interesting. I think first, like listening to like y'all responses, I'm like so inspired. One, but I think study is for me is definitely important. I think not wanting my work to be one dimensional or like just one layer to it, wanting like people to like view my work and to see like the symbolism in certain things. Like if I chose yellow for something, to have a reason for like, oh, yellow represents rituals and yellow also evokes this type of emotion. But I guess like, but getting that from the study and wanting people to be able to pull that, to pull the layers a part of it. And I think that's what also creates the longevity for the work also. And I think as a visual person, a person that's like centered in cinema, I think not wanting my work to just be about aesthetic either. I think sometimes I fall, or I try not to fall victim into that line of just aesthetic or like something looks nice, but forcing myself to go back into the books and also have mentors to like guide me and to like check me on certain things. Like, well, what was your reason? I need to have a reason for everything that I'm doing. If I don't have a reason, then I probably don't need to be doing it. And if I don't know what justice it does for the work, then it probably shouldn't be there. But I think I also got an interesting dynamic with study now of me trying to, as I'm coming into like the artist that I want to be, and as I'm growing, trying to figure out what my relationship with study looks like, which is why I was like so inspired by your responses, because I feel like that sounds so short of like how study works for y'all and like how y'all go into it. And I think like how where I'm at, I'll have like this idea in my mind of like all of these things that I want to like get out, all of these resources that I want to dive into. But I think what takes me out of study sometimes is like the overthinking. And it can be a lot of emotion sometimes, but also thinking about like the end result for the work. Like I know from Aaliyah's extension, that was like a struggle that I had, was like having all of these sources that I wanted to dive into, but getting so stuck in like, I guess the end result of the work and like kind of rushing past the study part and just being like, well, how are people going to intake this film? Like I got this visual in my head, but is this going to make sense? Like, would this come across in the best way forward? And I think I spend so much time in my head that sometimes the time that I spend in my head needs to be put into the study. Or I'm trying to make that transition from getting out of my head and put in the time that I know I want to put into the study and into it, because I think it's there, but not to the extent that I want it to be. But that's part of like the growth, and that's where I'm at in my journey.
I think something that I think about a lot is how like in mathematics, when you're learning about algebra, you're kind of learning like thousands of years of knowledge, you know, and you're getting it in X many class periods. And like the importance of study is they did it, so you don't have to. And so it's like when I'm thinking about life is not, you don't scroll through life, you know, it's an open world. And so I love to read and watch films and like go out of my comfort zone and kind of like break my algorithm a little bit just so I can like, I think be the most expansive person. You know what I mean? Like life is about exploring the self, it's about exploring what's beyond the self. And so I think when I was working on this painting, I'm really happy that Jessica sent me another one of her papers. And it was, I forget what had led us into the conversation, but we've been talking about like I think sisterhood and relationships and social death, and then like what even the process of, you know, entering onto the slave ship, like what does that do to a person, and how I think I approached the painting with like wanting to learn as much as possible about like Malia through Jessica's writing, and not even just Malia, but the context, the situation that she was in and how that might have impacted her. And I was just, I think really just like saturating myself in her world. But at the time, I wasn't really thinking about it as like studying. But then when I went to create the painting, there was this one specific day, which is like when I had been joking, like I think there were 8 iterations of this painting. Like the final iteration that stuck was it was a Saturday, and I had woke up early to start painting. And I was just so overwhelmed with like all of these emotions and everything that was swirling around my head. And all I could do was just sit down and finally like just get it out. And I guess like I think that's kind of the importance of study, you know, it's like the first iterations didn't stick because I don't feel like I knew enough or felt enough or was able to engage enough. And then, yeah, suddenly everything, kind of like the comps that you've been talking about, like all of that knowledge, all of that work, it's not about data, but it's about, I don't know, what you feel from it. Finally, all just like came out. But yeah, I think that's something moving forward in my life that I've been thinking a lot about. There's this poem, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically about like riding the wild horse that is your mind. And that's kind of what this like life is. And yeah, I think I just want to learn more about everything. And it's so intimidating because there's just so much to know and so much to learn. But I'm thinking even more about how the more you learn, the more you study, the more you see how everything is so interconnected, and like genuinely how we are all so interconnected that it's kind of eerie sometimes. And what can those parallels teach us? And how does that affect like the art and the things that we create? And yeah, similar to what you said, Romaine, like I don't really make art for myself at all. And I also really love what you said about like the silence, like what's between the lines, because I think Toni Morrison is my favorite writer in the entire world. And I love how she writes because she shows, she doesn't tell per se, you know what I mean? And like, there's this one part in Beloved that I go back to all the time. And it's right after Septa has given birth. And after that insane process, she looks out and like she sees on the water the spores from the ferns that have started to like float down. And it's like the shortest paragraph, but it's basically saying like, you know, these thousands of spores and how many are actually going to survive. And Toni Morrison is like showing without telling what Septa is feeling. And yeah, I think that's the important, like she knows so much about the natural world and is able to tie those parallels with us and plants and is able to kind of, I think, recount higher emotions. And I always joke, like, thank you for writing it so I didn't have to. You know what I mean? Like, whenever I'm reading poetry or seeing paintings or anything, like, thank you because I did not realize I was feeling that emotion. And then you laid it out for me. And now I have a deeper sense of who I am and who this world is, you know? So
Thank you. Thank you all. I am going to skip down to maybe like the last question, but I'm going to fold in some other things just so that I don't take up too much of your time today. But what is one issue or question that you'd like to see artists addressing today? Which you can think about for a minute, and I'm gonna add on to it. But also like what and right? What was the issue or question that really informed or drove the work that you did for this collection?
I think for me it was a spur in a way. And then I stuck on that. Like I think that for me it says a lot about I think where her mental state was. It wasn't and I remember asking Jessica about like what else did she do? And normally saying, you know, she would go to the market, like they would trust her to go to the market to sell fish. I was like, really? And she was like, yeah, because, you know, she could do math. You know, one of the few slaves that knew how to count. You know, and she's a teenager that could count and do math, and they trusted her with money. But another thing that really drew me to that, you know, that era of the notes was she was from a fishing village.
Yeah, so the conversation I remember that we had was you were asking, I was telling you about some of the other entries about Malia in between her escapes, and they called it pulling foot in the archive. And I remember saying that her owner would send her out onto the roads in between the estates, and she would just be selling fish. And I'll never forget the question that you asked me about that, because it was just something that it had not occurred to me before, even though I'd seen these entries in the archives again. You said, what kind of fish? And I said, oh, mudfish. And you told me, well, you know, that's a specific type of fish that you actually have to know how to preserve and prepare in a certain way. You can't just like say, hey, here's mudfish, now go out on the road and sell it. And so I love what you said earlier about silences, because I think especially within the historical discipline, there's this presumption that you are only supposed to look at what's there in the archive, what is right in front of you, what it says is the end all be all of knowledge production. And that is one thing that has been it's just been so transformative to me and how I practice history and being in this project, is because all of you of artists have seen and identified the silences within the archives surrounding Malia and somehow found a way to so beautifully create a visual, create a sound, create a feeling from those silences. And so it's made me more attentive to those silences within the archive surrounding Malia. Like, as you pointed out to me, the fact that her owner sends her out repeatedly to do this, it made me more attentive to how he describes other enslaved women that he owns, that he sends to also supposedly sell wares in the market. But then after they come back, he says, well, she's a poor market woman, so I'm not going to send her anymore. He never calls Malia a good one, but he keeps sending her out to do it. And so what are those silences? They're actually quite loud. Yes. If you think about them in the archive, that says a lot about her. If the fact that she was presumed to be a teenager when she's taken into the Atlantic slave trade, and she has preserved that knowledge of wherever it was that she came from to know. She knows how to handle fish. She knows how to count money. And she also knows how to sell it to other people. And we have to, well, we don't have to, but we can be intentional in how we see how she moves. It taught me to look at her fugitivity in certain ways that I never had before. Not just she's escaping 14 times. Where is she going? How long is she gone? Then I was looking at different details within the archive because her owner kept a very detailed record of labor, but he also was very interested in the weather. And so when I would look at her fugitivity escapes, I'd also looked at, well, what's the weather like when she's outside? And a lot of times it was pretty moderate, but then sometimes it wasn't. And she's still staying hidden for all these, for days or weeks at a time. That's another silence. He doesn't say anything about that, but it's a silence that's actually quite loud. And then you see how all of these different appearances that enslaved people make within the archives can be intimately connected. Because if she's staying hidden for so long within what is essentially a lot of forest and mountains and bush, how does she know the terrain so well to be able to do that? You can connect it to the times that he's sending her out to sell fish. Like, exactly. She's mapping out the terrain. Even though he's sending her out to make him money, she is doing double duty with that to form her own knowledge for where you're sending me out to move for one reason. When I choose to go out by myself, I'm going to put that knowledge to work for another reason. And I say all that to say that it was so critical for me to collaborate on this project at the time that I was, because it taught me how to build a dissertation project out of archival silences that are actually really loud. Enslaved women are screaming at us in the archives. They really, really are, both because and in spite of what their owners did, not just to them, but what they do very intentionally within the written record. And I think that this bridging of what we would call traditional history or historical methods is so critical for us to do that outside of the academy too, because it can show us what the blind spots of history have been. Like, Malia's story has been out there for years, but nobody's been paying attention to these things. And I am not above admitting that I may not have been paying attention to them too if I hadn't been able to collaborate with all of you. So thank you.
I think the thing that really drove me was like similar. He said, "What is she doing?" And he's like, "What?" It's like, "What is she doing in the bush? What is she doing when she's escaping?" And like, yeah, why? I just was trying to learn who she is. Yeah, that the other paper that you had shared with me was talking about a shipmate.
Yeah.
And that entire like section that like landed on she had a shipmate was basically talking about like that social death of this girl who was kidnapped from home, and now she's placed on this ship and she doesn't know anybody, and who she was gone, and now she's discovering who she is in an entirely new situation. And in order to survive the Martha, who do you hold on to? And the fact that like after Sylvia had passed, who did she run to, even though she had not seen this person in maybe like 2 years, is her shipmate, someone who was across the island. And how did she know about this person? Like, what is the telephone, the network that telephoned to this island to tell her where her sister is, you know? And so I think like for me, Malia is just so loud. And I think also the way that you write her is just, we had talked about it, like so much of it is excavating through this man's journals and giving her like just really fleshing her out. And I think you did it really beautifully because it just led me to such like vivid visions of, yeah, this young woman who could be dancing, could be crying, could be singing, could be doing anything. We were talking about like, I had seen her standing in the water, but I never see her face, you know, and how does that, impact me and the painting? And I'll remember Malia for the rest of my life, for sure. You know, like, oh my goodness. And it was so wild because I remember Julia and me were on a call too. And we realized we were called to so many of the same things, and seeing the same things. And so, yeah, I just think this project has been Like, it's just such a beautiful thing to be a part of. But I think, yeah, the number one question that really drove me was, what is she doing? What is she feeling? Like, just like, who is she? And trying to come to that conclusion.
I think the question that drove me in this project, ultimately because it's a question that came to me in a dream, and it's also translated in this work. And it's like, where are you now, little Black girl? And so when I think about Malia's story, even the idea of, the escape and what is she doing, on these multiple, in these moments of momentary marinage. And I just imagine that even at the end of the day, it's like ultimately her way of just not making herself useful for this system. And I think the question really, like the through line, literally, like, where are you? And I'm, in the last poem, as a storyteller, especially when I don't have the answer or there's not a one-for-one translation of how things ended up, I'm always going to be on the side of Black folks being victorious and Black folks getting away, Black folks getting revenge. Like, all of those things are super important to me as a storyteller. And so I was so invested in this idea of, like, where are you now? And, knowing that, she kind of falls off so-called the historical record, when she gets to Savannah. And so to me, I'm like, oh, now she's stateside. She has all these other routes that she can take. And so for me, it's like, I don't 100% know the exact pinpoint where she's at, but I'm imagining that it's not with the person who just purchased her. I'm imagining her somewhere else. And so the question is, like, where are you now? I'm imagining, again, knowing, and it's so sad because in the study part too, how vicious the system is. So even those momentary escapes, it's not a forever thing. It could be still very temporary, but I just wanted to know that she was elsewhere. And so the question was, like, always like where are you now? Even for the young folks, in some of my own work, that I refer to as like special specters, I imagine, like, little Lucy and Sylvia, like, where are you? Somewhere in this other dimension, collectively making some sort of magic that can try and disrupt, even again, if it's only temporarily, these harmful spaces that, that their loved ones find themselves in. So the question just, like, literally is just like, where are you now? That's the question I think that guides. And I will say this too, because one of the things I think about study too, like, yes, there's the silences, but I know sometimes I can get hyperfixated on a particular point and then you miss all this other stuff. And that's why I even like the idea of, like, research being like, oh, look again, like, keep searching. Because it's just like, oh, I completely missed this. I was so focused on this other thing that you can miss it. So to me, it's interesting that even in my mind, like, I'm still going to be connected to Malia's story, because I honestly still don't feel like I've done this project. We've done this project collectively, but I don't know if I know all that there is to still know about something that even happened centuries ago. It's like, oh, we could still be learning more. We can keep looking. Where are you now, like, in study? Where are you now in your point of inquiry? Where are you now? And just how you feel about it. So yeah, that's I think the guiding question. I'm probably going to take that with me even away from here today.
Tatiana and Julia, those two questions I think are just so important to ask, especially of Malia, especially, like, who are you? And I say that because for many years within the existing historical discourse about this particular archive and about Malia, that question has been posed and answered in a very specific way. She has literally been called certain things. She's been called a slave rebel. She's been called antisocial. She's been characterized in a certain way. And I think that characterization has largely accounted for why we haven't seen writings and histories about her that are more reflective of how we see her. Because many years ago, she was that the question of who is Malia. Well, first of all, she wasn't even called Malia. And within the historical scholarship, her slave name is the one that she's referred to. And so, first of all, like, who is she? Malia's no one. She's nowhere, which is also an important question to ask. But where are you now, little Black girl? For many years, she's been nowhere. And I think that is why this project, and one of the reasons why this project is so important, is because it shows that there are multiple answers to that question based upon who's asking it. And based upon what the answers are. First, what are the methods that they're using to answer that question?
I think historically, people don't like to write about rebels because then you're just going to give more power where you don't want to give more power. And I think because she was such a rebel, you didn't want to give that kind of information. So even if he knew a lot of things that were happening, you probably write down specific things because at some point someone's going to read your journal. But you don't want to give so much information because then that's empire. And as a way of discipline, she runs away, you're going to beat her, chain her, lock her up to show the others that, hey, I am in charge and you can't be doing that. But she's saying to you, well, I really don't care. I'm still going to keep doing it, And I love her story because I see that reflected in a lot of Black women in modern society. Like they will just take charge and they will cause a riot because they know what they're worth and they will do whatever it takes to get it. So for me, Malia didn't just kind of disappear in Savannah. She continued basically in everybody else, and that's why I was asking you, can write a book so it can continue to inspire other people, because I think, it needs to be said, it needs to be recorded in this way and in this light.
Yes.
I'm
She's writing a book. I can answer that for her as well. She will be writing a book. Sha-Shonna?
For me, I think the question and concern, I think the concern was like not being able to carry legacy in like the physical form. I think I fell a lot into like the motherhood of Malia and just thinking about like as a mother when you're not able to like to experience like somebody that you grew inside of yourself, somebody that you birthed, like the pain that comes with that, and thinking about my own family and my mother, my grandmother, and like the joy that they have from like seeing like their kids and their daughters like grow up to become women and just grow into like themselves, and realizing like Malia was taken from her. Like she wasn't given like that space or opportunity to be able to experience that. And I feel like I fell into Sylvia's energy a lot too, of like, what would Sylvia be like if she was able to like live past 15 months? Like how would she carry herself? And also thinking about like the friends and like the people around me too. I remember I had one friend who I think her great grandfather was like Jamaican, but she would carry, I remember in high school she had like a mini Jamaican flag and she would just carry it with her, because to her it was like, I'm not as connected to like that part of me, but carrying like the legacy of just knowing like where I come from and like, I guess like just the family background. So when I was making Malia's extension, just trying to pull pieces from things that I've experienced from people around me, but also how would Sylvia be, but in like the physical form, like in the scene, it's a scene where you have, I guess like, well, not I guess, but like you have a woman walking into the water, but for me, I wanted it to be like a symbolization or like a symbol for her, the possibility of her daughter like going to connect with her. This could be her daughter going into the water, because Sylvia spent a lot of time just finding solace and peace in water. The scene where you have a woman holding up the Black liberation flag but wearing like a Jamaican shirt. Sylvia could have been a girl who just wanted to like hold on to like the pieces of her mom in different ways. I think that was like the biggest thing, is like, what do you do when you aren't able to like carry on like the legacy in a physical form? Or how can I like portray that in the best way? Yeah, I think just the pain of like the motherhood, I think that was like the biggest thing for me. I think mothers, like, they go through a lot, and I think her story is so unfair. And I know it's not just Malia, and that was something else that I wanted to fall into, is that I know Malia, that pain of motherhood is like so many women who were enslaved, like dealing with like the same things of not being able to see like their children become, to go through life or to just like experience them in like the fullest capacity.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to give you some time in your day back But I do want to ask, does anybody have anything they would like to add or to end on?
I think, okay, so can you tell me the story of the lunar rainbow one more time?
Yes. That was the lunar rainbow comes from another element of Malia's story that I found to be transformative to me, because I mentioned earlier that she has been characterized by other historians as being antisocial. And in my own research, I found that not to be the case, because initially, because of the instance where you cited one of her escapes, she went to go see a shipmate. And if you do research in histories of slavery, you know that the shipmate describes a bond that has even enslavers described it as a bond that's closer than brotherhood or sisterhood. So that was one of the instances where I immediately began to question how I was seeing Malia. And so it made me start to study the lives of other people within her immediate proximity. Who is she interacting with? Who is she experiencing enslavement with? And one of the people that came to my attention was, two people, I should say. Malia was taken into captivity into Westmoreland alongside 5 other people. It was three enslaved young women / girls, and then 3 enslaved young men. And one of the other enslaved young women she was taken into captivity, his name was Ogo. And Ogo was and within the archive, it's called given to a seasoner. And a seasoner is a name that's used to describe an enslaved person who already lives upon the estate, and they are entrusted into taking in the new arrivals. If they don't speak English, it's their responsibility to teach them English. They take them into their homes. They're responsible for feeding them and basically acclimating them to enslavement and making them accept, more or less, their circumstances. And so Malia was given to a seasoner named Wanga, and Ogo was given to a seasoner named Egypt Lucy. And because Malia and Ogo appear within the archive together at the same time, typically that means that they were probably together upon the slave ship. When they're sold in big batches like that, it's pretty safe to assume that they were purchased at the same time. And I say that because after one of Malia's escape attempts, when she's brought back, her owner is punishing her by locking her into a set of iron bar restraints called bilbos. And then he writes that he was going to leave her there all night alone, but he was interrupted, and he calls it at the intercession of Egypt Lucy, did not lock her in the bilbos that night, but just decided not to. And that caught my attention because I thought, well, why would he do that? First of all, and then why would he listen to this other enslaved woman named Egypt Lucy? And so that led me down a larger rabbit hole first, because I'm like, well, why would he agree to do that? But then why did Egypt Lucy speak up to do it in the first place? And so that led me down a rabbit hole to make me kind of explore this history between Malia's enslaver and Egypt Lucy. And then I began to examine the relationship that Egypt Lucy had to Ogo within the archives. And in doing so, I came across when Ogo had her first daughter, who was the same age as Sylvia, I should say. Malia and Ogo gave birth within weeks of one another. Ogo named her first daughter Lucy. And in doing research and within just the broader historiography on slavery in Jamaica among enslaved women during this time period, naming is something that historians pay attention to, especially within smaller localized settings like the one that Malia and Ogo lived on at the time. At the time that they gave birth, they lived on a pen, which was a much smaller format. And so I began to examine Egypt Lucy as an enslaved person and what were her relationships like. And she had a lot of extended non-familial kinship ties within the community. And so that made me pay a little bit more attention and maybe start to speculate as to what the relationship could have been between her and Ogo as this season or seasonee relationship, because within that relationship, that too was a really potentially transformative relationship because a lot of enslaved people didn't survive their seasoning period in Jamaica. That's a really long way of answering your question. But there's a reason for it, because infant mortality in Jamaica was extremely high. Enslaved babies were not expected to live. Half of enslaved babies in Jamaica died before they reached the age of 2. It was a big deal that Sylvia got to 15 months in the first place. But Ogo's first daughter, Lucy, lived to be 10, which was almost unheard of. And when she did finally die, it was enough to warrant the notice of Malia and Ogo's enslaver, because he writes about the night that she dies in very exacting detail. And one of the things that he writes about is, at first, her coffin is built, and then she has a small funeral. But the night of the funeral, when she dies, he writes that a lunar rainbow appeared in the sky. And the way that it appears in the archive is also very striking, because he draws this line right in front of it, and it writes, "A large lunar rainbow in the west." And I'd never heard of that before. He said, "What's a lunar rainbow?" Well, it's called a moon rainbow, and it's this optical illusion where the moisture and the light of the moon refracts just so that it looks like a rainbow at night. If you've never seen it before, you should. It's pretty striking. And so this is, again, going back to what Romaine was saying about silences, right? Those moments where enslaved people aren't writing or talking, but it's such a powerful moment if you think about what that would mean for a community where infant mortality is so high. To have this child make it that long, what kind of impact we don't get to see or hear what the impact was, but the silence of that silence is still very loud. And so the lunar loop, the lunar rainbow, that was in the paper that you wrote, kind of alluded to that moment of Ogo's first daughter Lucy's death. But I think it's also really important to point out that I wouldn't have really been able to appreciate that unless I questioned the initial presumption that Malia was antisocial. If you follow the threads, if you follow the relationships between enslaved people, there's a much more intricate story to that. And so even at this horrible site of loss, at the gravesite of an enslaved little girl, is this broader story of enslaved life. Someone ensured that they did what they could to ensure that she lived 10 years longer than she was supposed to. So that's what I mean when I say that enslaved women are screaming from the archives.
In the poem Little Lucy and the Lunar Loop, like I'm really trying to tap into that, the lunar loop being an obvious sign, to give the folks, that are still earthside, to give them some sort of sign in their grief and in their moment of mourning, to like something to anchor their mourning to. Yeah, that particular detail. I mean, and I'm like, oh, that's when the full poet comes out and emerges and is like, I need to do something useful with this. I mean, that's what it meant to me. Like, it instantly, that's just how I felt, right? So even beyond just like trying to turn it into something, like I think I was turning it in for other readers, what it felt like for me to read that detail.
Thank you all so much for your time, for your art, for your contributions, for your intentionality. I'm very much looking forward to the talk tomorrow and, following all of you all moving forward in the work that you do tomorrow and next month and next year and 10 years from now. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thank you.